Hi everybody, welcome back to the Renaissance Woodworker. I'm Shannon Rogers, I'm your host. Welcome into my wood shop. I'm about to begin a new project. I'm building a shaker, kind of the iconic shaker wall clock as part of a project for the hand tool school. But I wanted to take a time out real quick before I dove into this to talk a little bit about getting prepared for the new project. Now, a lot of us use SketchUp now or have maybe a plan or something like that to get the idea of the design and the idea of what we're going to build. And we'll use that model to get a general idea of how much lumber, how many board feet of lumber am I going to need. Generally, when I go to the lumber yard, I have an idea in my mind, kind of a best case and a worst case scenario. Best case would be if I could find that one board that's wide enough for the widest part of my piece, or I could get the most visible parts of my piece out of the same board for a good color and grain match. And then I have the worst case scenario, and generally that's centered around an 8-foot long by 6-inch wide board, because that's really the definition of FAS grade, or first and second grade lumber. The board must be at least 6 inches wide and at least 8 feet long. Now that board can have sapwood. Sapwood is not a defect for North American Hardwood Lumber Association grading, NHLA grading. Those are the people that have set the rules for FAS and select and common grades. But it's a safe bet that you can get, if you're buying FAS, that you can get a 6-inch wide piece free of sap. Because for the most part, the lumber is sold in 8-inch widths because of the fact that you can generally get 6 inches out of there. Even though sapwood's not a defect, the market today has come to demand more heartwood in their lumber. So my worst case scenario is, how many boards am I going to need if I can only get a 6-inch wide by 8-foot long board? What panels am I going to have to glue up? That type of thing. So I'll walk into the lumber yard armed with this information, and generally in the trunk of my car at all times, I've got kind of an old beat up block plane. This thing is really not that sharp, nor is it really that flat, and frankly, I very rarely ever take it out of the trunk. It's just to kind of quickly get a feel for what the grain looks like under some of the rough saw marks. Now certainly make sure that the owner of the lumberyard knows that you want to do this and is okay with it. I've never met a lumberyard owner who's had a problem with it, just as long as you're not making a huge mess and planing the whole board. But frankly, if you plane an 8-foot long board using this block plane, kudos to you. I'll usually have, of course, a tape measure, and I always have my rough lumber saw. This is a crosscut saw. It's actually set with a 6 points per inch tooth configuration. Doesn't matter as long as you have a saw that, it may not be the best saw in the world, but you kind of keep it around. And this is because I don't have a truck. I'm not really able to carry really long lumber. If you've got a pickup truck or some way to carry 8-foot, 10-foot, 12-foot long lumber, hey, don't worry about it. For me, I generally have to break down my stock just to get it into my car and get it home. So having that list of what size boards I'm going to need and what my parts kind of need to look like, then in my mind I can come in and I have a pencil, or I usually have a lumber crayon. You can get these things in white, black, blue, red, all kinds of things. They mark up rough lumber surfaces really easily. I'll just mark out, usually adding 2 inches to my final dimensions, and I'll saw out pieces close to size so that they fit in the car and I can get everything home. So the saw can be really useful. If you're not crazy like me and you want to use a circular saw, cordless circular saw is not a bad idea. Then again, most lumber yards will make a couple of cuts for you. So if you only need a couple of boards and just need each of those boards, with one cut on it, they'll do it for you without a problem. So you've gotten back to the shop. You've got your lumber. Maybe you even have done a little bit of planing. In working with hand tools, I generally try to get as close to finished size as I can before I begin planing. A wider board, this is a 11-inch wide piece of cherry. The cup is much more pronounced. It's actually a pretty flat board, but you can see there's a little bit of cup in this. if I only need, well, this board I'm probably going to use for rails and styles of the clock, I'm only going to need 1 to 1.5 inch strips. Well, if I rip this down to 1 to 1.5 inches, that cup is almost gone. And it's going to take very little effort for me to plane it by hand. So certainly I don't want to dimension in with the rough lumber all the way down to my size, because I need to make room for planing and milling. Plus, if you don't have the best view of the grain, if you can't really tell what the grain looks like through the roughs on stuff, you don't want to determine all your pieces before then, or you might end up with a kind of a weird grain match. So generally, I will have boards cut to approximate length, and I'll either hand plane them real quickly so I can see the grain, or I'll just skip planing through my thickness planer. And skip planing, again, is not worrying about jointing a face, just kind of running it and removing the rough saw marks. And that's what's been done to this board. It's just been skip planed, and I've got a really good feel for what the grain looks like. So now I need to begin laying out all of the parts for my project. And it sometimes can be really confusing where everything goes and how to get the grain and how to get the color match perfectly lined up. Here's an instance where maybe going back to SketchUp can be really beneficial for you. So here we are in SketchUp, and I've laid out 2 boards, 2 rectangles, and I use the push-pull tool just to pull them up to 1 inches. That's not even really necessary. And I've laid out my best and my worst case scenario. Up top here is a typical FAS board. It's 6 inches wide and it's 8 feet long. And below is my best case scenario. The widest piece that I need for this clock is the back panel, and that's just over 9 inches wide. So this is a 10-inch wide board and 8 feet long. So from here, I need to essentially lay my parts into these boards. Now this is a relatively small project that I ought to be able to get out of maybe 2 boards. So obviously I would need to create more boards in order to line all my parts up. But if you've ever seen a cut list, like a plywood cut list or something like that, and you see just the different rectangles laid into it, and it ends up looking a little bit like this. Let's zoom extends a little bit and come up here. And this is actually my complete project. The other thing that's helpful here is you set the camera view on this to parallel projection. The perspective drawing tends to throw things off a little bit. So I've got 2 6-inch wide boards, and I've actually got a 10-inch wide board up here. And this is what ends up being my best case scenario. Now, again, I work for a lumber yard, and I know that I can get a 10-inch wide board because I have seen them when I was at work today. So, you may have to do this a little bit differently, but I'm not going to walk through both best and worst case scenarios. But here, I look at my project and the most important part, and I start laying those in first. In the instance of this clock, the 2 case sides are really very, very important. So I lay in a rectangle over here and a duplicate rectangle. I actually just copied and moved the rectangle down here. And you notice I've got a substantial amount of space in between. I also lined these rectangles right up at the edge. The reality is that I may not want to do that. There might be a little bit of wane or ragged edge or even some sapwood here. But there's a substantial distance. I think I've got a full inch in between those, just using the tape measure. An inch is plenty of space for me to use a rip saw, or if you were to use some sort of power tool to cut that out. Then I begin looking at grouping my pieces together. I want the pieces that are going to go next to each other in the model to all come from the same area of the wood. So obviously my 2 case sides, while they're opposite of one another in the model, they do need to be a good consistent color. So pulling them right from the same section of board, you'll end up with a much better grain match. If we come down to this other board here, this is where I determined I would need to make panels. I have to have a panel for the door that's on the front, and I have to have a panel for the back. Now the back panel is really not that important because it's the back and you're not going to see it. So I'm taking each half of that panel from 2 separate boards. Not a big deal. However, this panel is probably the most visible feature, other than probably the clock face, of this design. So I'm taking them one right after another. I'm going to really good grain match here. If you wanted the ultimate panel, you suppose you could get a thicker board and actually saw it out and then resaw it to book match it. But I don't want a book match pattern here, and I think a good sequential match will be just fine. But if you put them right next to one another, you're going to have a much better grain match. Now when I drew these rectangles in here, they're actually a little bit larger than I need them to be. It's kind of difficult. It's possible, if you look up here, you can see there's a space between these two rectangles and there's a space between these two rectangles. It actually is a little bit more difficult in SketchUp because if you notice, the cursor wants to snap to those lines. If we zoom in here, it snaps right out the corner, and as I come over here, okay, I can get a midpoint, but it really wants to snap to those different lines. So if I come in and switch to the rectangle tool and I want to draw a rectangle and say start, this is snapping to the midpoint because I have another rectangle already drawn. But if you want to try to set it off a kerf distance, it's just too difficult. So generally what I do is just draw the rectangles right next to one another. But as I say draw the rectangle, and let's say I need it to be 5 inches wide by 24 inches long, that's the final dimension. I'll enter like 5.5 by what did I say, 24? I'll just do 25 inches. And whoops, well that drew a separate rectangle, but you get the idea. You add in, as you type in your dimensions, you add that extra space to make up for that saw curves, just so you don't end up with a nice layout drawing here with all these different parts and suddenly they're not going to be big enough when you factor in the saw curve. The last thing you want to end up with is having no room for error, having to get your saw curve exactly right, and if you're working by hand, having to actually plane down those ends and be dealing with a 32nd of an inch is just no fun. So always make sure you make your measurements a little bit larger. Again, you can see this mess of lines up here. These are the rails and stiles for the top door and the lower door, and you can see they're all lumped and grouped in together here. I'm going to get really consistent grain pattern and really consistent color by doing this all together. So, it's not rocket science here, but being able to lay your physical part sizes into the boards that you have or are going to get or shooting to go get at the lumberyard will really help you end up with a much better color and grain match in your project. Now the reality is once you get those boards, you need to take a much closer look. If you have a knot in the board, you've got some swirling grain, or say I end up with some curl in the board, I don't necessarily want to put my rails and stiles in that curly section of the board. I want nice straight grain for my rails and stiles. So if this 10-inch wide board is typical and it has cathedral patterns running up the center, it will have straight kind of riff-sawn grain on the two edges. So I would probably want to group these rails and stiles together and then move this row of rails and stiles and this row of rails and stiles down to the other end and omit the cathedral pattern in the middle. Again, these are all things that once you have your boards, you can actually come in and redraw this and use, say, the tape measure and some guidelines or something. Say I know that the cathedral pattern starts right about here and it starts here on the other edge. You can draw on these guidelines and know that, why didn't that draw? Come on, there we go. So now when I come in with my rectangle, I know that I want to stay away from this area here. These are where the cathedrals are, and the riff sawn or the straight grain starts from here out. So I want to lump all my rails and stiles in here. Again, that's once you have the board. When you're planning before you go to the lumber yard, this is all just kind of rough guesstimation. So the ideal world would be you plan all this out, this is the exact stock you need. You can see all of this board down here is unspoken for. This is all left over. So you've got a fair amount of waste, but it doesn't hurt to go ahead and say, you know what, I'm going to stack the cards in my favor and I'm going to buy another board. Because ultimately, if you're buying a piece of cherry or walnut and an FAS board, you're only looking at about 4 to 5 additional board feet to buy that one more board of 6-inch wide, 8-foot long piece. And it's not going to break the bank. So there you go. SketchUp can actually save you quite a bit of heartache by just having a plan for where you're going to pull your parts. Now, I can't stress enough, make sure you leave enough space in your model to accommodate saw curves, whether you're using hand saws or power saws to dimension your stock. Give yourself more than you think you're going to need. The last thing you want to end up with is a board that's finished to width that you need to rip down the middle and you have no margin for error. You have exactly a saw curve width, or you're going to end up with your pieces too narrow. Don't do it. So you can even print out a full-size version of that board we just modeled in SketchUp and even lay it out on your pieces and transfer over from there. Again, it's just a guide, and I frankly have never done this. It's just nice to kind of put all the pieces of your joinery puzzle together and lay them on the board. People do this with plywood all the time. Why not do it with regular hardwood or softwood lumber? Thanks for stopping by, guys, and good luck in planning your projects. See you next time.